The history of superhero movies are often divided into the pre and post Marvel Cinematic Universe eras. However, we have a special treatment when it comes to the Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire, especially the first and second one. Spider-Man 3 is, well, not exactly a good movie. Anyway, what if I tell that would exist a fourth movie with the same director and Tobey Maguire himself? And not only that, but even a tie-in game was promised to redefine open world mechanics, planned to be the best superhero game of all time. You didn't misunderstood. We will talk today about a cancelled game of a cancelled movie. We have a lot to talk, so let's get the video started. Before we get into the games, we should probably explain the context of these movies at the time. Back when the genre was still finding its feet, Spider-Man showed that comic book movies could dominate one entire generation. When the first movie was released in 2002, it was an instant hit. At the time, it was the highest grossing superhero movie in history, and to this day, it is remembered as one of the best. Tobey Maguire's performance as Peter Parker in particular was highly praised at the time for being an extremely relatable version of the hero for the audience. And in my opinion, he remains the best lead actor in all the Spider-Man movies to this day. After the massive success of the first movie, it didn't take long for a sequel to be made. Spider-Man 2 was released in 2004, and for many people, me included, thinks that it's even better than the first one. Often cited as one of the best superhero movies ever made, the 2004 sequel raised the bar for the franchise in every way, even winning an Oscar for Best Visual Effects at the time. And did the franchise end there? Not yet. In 2007, another movie was released. You probably remember that one too. The third movie suffered from too many storylines and antagonists, preventing any character from being fully developed. And this many antagonists wasn't the director's choice. It was a result of Sony's intervention. The biggest point of disagreement was the studio's pressure to include the villain Venom. Sam Raimi wasn't a fan of the character and didn't intend to use him, preferring to focus on a dynamic between Sandman and Vulture. In the end, believe it or not, even though this movie was mediocre, it was the most profitable movie in the trilogy. It earned almost $900 million worldwide. So of course, money spoke louder, and the producers at Sony began thinking about a fourth installment. The director himself admitted at the time that he was unhappy with the third film because he couldn't make the story work due to the creative concessions he had to make. But at the same time, this motivated him to try to redeem himself with another movie in the franchise. The development of the fourth movie began exactly 1 year after the release of the previous one, and from the early stages, Sony had already established a release schedule. The movie was set to be released on May 6, 2011, which left limited time for the script revisions. The director intended to use antagonists who had a strong emotional or thematic connection to the hero, maintaining the tone of his previous movies. In addition to having Vulture as the main villain, something the director had wanted since Spider-Man 3, there would also be the villains, Mysterio, Shocker, Prowler, Rhino, and the Lizard. And believe it or not, actors had even been cast for some roles. John Malkovich had been chosen to play Adrian Toomes the Vulture, and even Anne Hathaway was practically signed on at the time. She would have played Black Cat, serving as a new love interest for Peter Parker during a breakup with Mary Jane. The movie's cancellation allowed her to ironically play Catwoman in another superhero movie, Batman: The Dark Knight Rises. All of this is documented thanks to leaks of the concept art for the movie. You are seeing some of these images in the background. Of course, they would not miss the opportunity to create a tie-in game and capitalize on the hype surrounding the movie. The development for the Spider-Man 4 game began in 2008. Led by the studio Radical Entertainment, it was intended for release on Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC, but releases for other platforms were also planned. The Wii version was handled by Eurocom, and the Nintendo DS version was given to Vicarious Visions. We have a lot to say about these builds, so let's start with the main version of the game developed by Radical. Radical Entertainment used its proprietary engine called Titanium and assets from its latest game, Prototype, released in 2009, to build the New York City for Spider-Man 4. Radical Entertainment's version of the game was the most advanced in development, but it was still far from complete. Developers estimated that the game was about 10 to 15% complete, with only a handful of missions finished. This version was one of those that were leaked and can be found on the Internet Archive in its Xbox 360 version. So, to demonstrate this version, let's take a look at the gameplay. Two builds of this game have been uploaded, one dated November 20, 2009 and another from October 16 of the same year. I should warn you that both versions have many bugs and random crashes. What differs between them is the number of available missions and some polish, but in overall they were very similar. One interesting thing to note is that the cutscenes don't even exist yet, so what we have are storyboards of how the scenes were supposed to be rendered. And here is the list of missions available in the game, some of which are mechanics tests, others involve collectibles, battles, and so on. It's interesting to note that even in this alpha stage of the game, the city already had relatively well-modeled areas, such as the Times Square. Obviously, much of the city lacks collision detection, but the basis for New York was already in place. This was relatively simple for them to develop because they essentially used the same city from the first prototype game, which is also set in New York. And this becomes clear when you compare, for example, the prototype's Times Square with Spider-Man's version. It even has the same billboards. But that's not the only thing they borrow from prototype, even the mini-map were based on it. Another thing is that the game has almost no sound effects, just this action music playing throughout the entire gameplay. It even had a mechanic where you could listen to the police radio, so you could go to where a crime was happening. The problem is getting there, since, as I mentioned before, the buildings are buggy and many lack collision detection.
911, please state your emergency. There's a bunch of thugs smashing stuff up and threatening people. You gotta get someone down here before things get out of hand. Stay in the building. We'll get someone out there as soon as we can.
Anyway, the combat was actually pretty interesting. There were even some combos you could pull off, but obviously some animations weren't finished, so it was possible for you to suddenly appear in a T-pose out of nowhere. In any case, even after the movie and game were cancelled, Radical didn't completely scrap the project. Instead, they modified the movement systems, web physics, and city models to create what would become Prototype 2. One curiosity is that even the James Heller's tentacles and powers in Prototype 2 are, in fact, a direct evolution of the web mechanics developed for Spider-Man, and this is particularly evident when comparing the mechanics used in Spider-Man to bring down helicopters with those in Prototype 2. Now let's talk about the Wii version from Eurocom. I'll start by saying that it's obviously very different from the version I showed you a moment ago. It was literally a different game, trying to be a bit more linear, but that's questionable because of what I was going to show you later. When you load the game into the Dolphin emulator, the emulator recognizes it as the game Dead Space Extraction, another game released by Eurocom. This already indicates that the engine from the Wii version of Dead Space was used as the basis for creating the Spider-Man game. The first thing you'll notice is that the menu is styled to resemble the pages of the Daily Bugle newspaper. It's really cool that they already did this, even at such an early stage of the development. So there are a few things we can test in the game. It has 2 playable levels and a debug menu that we'll explore a bit later. Let's start by showing the first playable level. Upon entering the level, the first thing you notice is that the game is in such an early stage that there are absolutely no textures in the entire city. I also want to mention that this game is running on the Dolphin emulator and has its resolution upscaled to 4K. But you'll see that for a game designed for the Nintendo Wii, it actually looks quite good. The first thing about the gameplay is that swinging on webs was restricted to specific points highlighted in green, and you basically jump and press the button at the right time to swing. The first two levels consist of areas where you swing on webs, attack enemies, and the game also included a photography system where Spider-Man had to take photos of evidence or crime scenes for the Daily Bugle. And even though it's clearly very incomplete, the combat is relatively fluid, already featuring a good set of moves, and honestly, I didn't encounter any T-poses during them, something that happened often in the Xbox 360 version. In addition to the two available game levels, there's also a very interesting section of the menu, the debug menu. Here, you can test out several different game scenarios, and I'll tell you that when playing through the emulator, the graphics are very detailed and quite beautiful for a Nintendo Wii. To prove this, I will show two different areas. The first one is the Chinatown area. And Little Italy. It turned out pretty cool, didn't it? They also have a map for testing lighting effects that look really nice on the Nintendo Wii, especially with the nighttime setting and light reflections. In addition to gameplay footage, you can also access an asset viewer where you can see some characters that have already been created for the game, in this case 3, including Spider-Man himself. And finally, there's also an environment simulator that's literally used to demonstrate how the city behaves in the game engine, showing a simulation of cars and NPCs moving through the city streets. This leads us to believe that perhaps this game won't necessarily be entirely linear, and there might also be some kind of open world, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense for them to have spent so much time testing the simulation of the city itself, right? One last interesting thing, when I ejected the game from the emulator, it showed me this screen. It literally says the name Spider-Man, Dawn of Arachnophobia. I wonder if that was just a joke used as the game's codename, but if so, it's pretty cool, right? Unfortunately, there is no information available about the Nintendo DS version of the game since it was never leaked. So if you know anything about it, please leave a comment below. Let's briefly discuss why the movie was cancelled. The main factor was Raimi's disappointment with the scripts presented, and with the release date set for May 2011, Raimi realized he wouldn't be able to finish a high quality movie in time. Additionally, production costs were skyrocketing even though production had only just begun. Rumors suggest that Tobey Maguire had negotiated a $50 million salary for 2 new movies, and Kirsten Dunst was also seeking significant raises. Additionally, Sony already had a plan B, a written script for a reboot that focused on a younger Peter Parker. Faced with Raimi's exhaustion and logistical challenges, Sony decided to cancel Spider-Man 4 and announced just 10 days later that Mark Webb would direct a reboot of the franchise, which would become The Amazing Spider-Man. And obviously the games were also cancelled, with the Xbox 360 version serving as the source material for Prototype 2 and the Wii version being more or less forgotten forever, since I don't think any Eurocom game ever used anything from it. Would Spider-Man 4 have been better than the reboot we eventually got? Did the two games seem promising? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.